my memory serves me correctly, it was while I was driving around the city of Indianapolis that I got the first hint of trouble. I was headed to do an event like this for a congregation in that area, and was getting close to my destination when my phone rang. And on the other end of the line was a young man that I know who asked if before this telephone call, this young man had been working as an intern with a congregation, planning to devote his life to preaching the gospel and doing some training with an older preacher there. And he had decided that before he went down that road, he really wanted to pursue more education. And since he was just newly married and didn't have any kids, it seemed like the right time in life to do that. So he left his internship early. He got a job. He was going back to school, working on his master's degree. And now 6 months had gone by, and he was calling and wanting to talk. So the first thing he said to me on the phone call was, "Now don't freak out." I really don't know why people say that, because that's the first thing I do when people say, "Don't freak out." He said, "I want to talk to you about alcohol, but I don't want you to think I'm drinking or I want to drink. I was just out with some people last night and the subject came up and some things were said and I really didn't know how to respond. And so I want to run some of this stuff by you and I want to get your thoughts about it." And so we talked. I think it was about 20 minutes or so. I answered a few questions for him. He seemed content with what I said. And we said our goodbyes and got off the phone. But I was not content. It was one of those phone calls that you just felt creepy about. Like, okay, there's more going on here. I'm not getting the whole story. And there was, because that was only the first call. There were more. There were more calls and more questions. And over time, the questions grew more basic, more fundamental. So one call we're talking about, what do you do with these imprecatory psalms? How can they be in the Bible? And then we're talking about the Bible and is the evidence for the Bible being the Word of God really compelling? And then I was having a conversation with this young man that I know about whether or not the evidence for God was compelling. Remember the young man that was grooming himself to preach the gospel? Now, a few months later, is just teetering on the edge of losing his faith altogether. It's just this astonishingly brief period of time. Now, what I know and what you know is that is not an unusual story. I just know too many of the kids to be naive about that. We have an epidemic among us of young people losing their faith. And I know a lot of these kids and I talk to a lot of these kids. But this kid was different. Because it wasn't just a random kid that I know losing his faith. It was my kid, my son, losing his faith. Over the last few years, I have been a little more transparent in my teaching about the journey that my wife and I are making with our wayward child. In fact, the sermon I'm going to preach tonight, if I can find a way to do it, I preach it everywhere I go. And typically when I do, I just get this flood of response. I have been at the building longer than the service, talking to people afterward who wanted to share their story and their grief. And I'll stay tonight too, if you want to share. But I've learned some things as I've gone through that process. I am astonished how many people are dealing with wayward children. I think I've always known that those people were among us. I just don't think I knew how large the crowd was. I just finished a class at the end of last year, a class for parents with wayward kids. And when it was over, one of the people who'd been in the class came up to me and said, the thing that troubled me most about your class was that it was so full. Every class period. My mind around how many people are struggling with this. I began to reflect on my preaching, and I wondered what I had done over 3 decades at that time of preaching to minister to those people. And I have to tell you that was a disturbing process to me, because to be honest with you, certainly at intervals I had referenced wayward people in lessons. But I have to admit, over 30 years of preaching at that time, I had not preached one lesson like this designed to help people who were trying to cope with wayward kids. And then I thought about all the lessons that I had preached about raising kids and parenting. And Steve, that's a big fat folder in my filing cabinet. Lots and lots of lessons. And I thought, wow, that must have been just like pouring salt in the wound for parents grieving their prodigals. So I want to make up for some lost ground tonight and talk to you about ministering to our prodigals. I have a couple of things in mind for the lesson tonight. If I don't do anything but sensitize all of us to this hurting, growing crowd among us, I don't want to be dark and pessimistic, but I am thinking in the decades to come, the crowd with wayward children is not going to get smaller. And so if I could raise our sensitivity to that crowd, that hurting crowd, then this time would have been well spent. In fact, if you want to extend the value of what we're talking about tonight, think about the other hurting people among us, hurting for other reasons that maybe we've overlooked, like people with wayward children. I've thought a lot about that as I've wandered through this process. The second thing I'm hoping tonight is that we can say some things that will be equipping for parents with wayward kids. Maybe we can offer you some consolation and some guidance as you try to work through that process. And for those who don't have wayward kids, but you care about the people that do, maybe you'll pick up some things that will help you be a good family member to this hurting crowd and minister well to them. Having laid all that out, Lorenzo is terrified about the length of this sermon tonight. I think he's probably already writing a text for me. Send this one at 11 tonight, Lorenzo. I will tell you that I am a little worried about the sermon because I just spent a whole quarter teaching on this. There aren't enough hours tonight to go through all of it. So I just want to say a few things to you. I will tell you, as I did in one of the morning sessions, I am ripping off a friend tonight. About a year after our son lost his faith, I had a friend write me a letter that's been very, very important and useful to me. And a lot of that wisdom I am incorporating into the lesson tonight. I say that to you because if you like the things that I say, I will be happy to take credit for it. If you don't, I'm happy to throw him under the bus, whichever way works for me. So 4 things I want to say to you in the lesson tonight. I want to begin with this. If you are dealing with a prodigal child, I want you to know that you're not alone. Has that been up there the whole time? And I didn't even push the button. I don't know how that happens. I'm not at home. I can't blame the tech guys. That would not be a right thing for me to do. So you've been looking at it. Keep looking at it. You're not alone. Again, I think I've always known that. I think what we do not appreciate is how many people there are. After all, folks, this is not information that we advertise, right? If your kid hits the game-winning home run in the high school World Series, man, you're hoping someone caught a picture of that so you can post it on social media. We want everyone to know. But when your kid is losing his faith, we don't want anyone to know, right? I preached this lesson at a congregation I worked with for 12 years. And when I was done, one of the men came up to me and told me about his wayward son. I did not know. The guy I'd known for 12 years. I didn't know he had a wayward son. I didn't know he had a son. And so often we're keeping the secret. We're not talking about it. It's not a new problem, right? Think back to Tuesday night, Cain and Abel. It's a problem as old as Cain and Abel. Adam and Eve had a son that was murderously rebellious, and they were not unique. Think about the great judge Samuel, who appointed his sons to follow in his footsteps, and they were bad. We're told in 1 Samuel 8 and verse 1, they perverted justice and took bribes, and I suppose along the way just embarrassed their father and broke his heart. And then after him, King David, a man who was called a man after God's own heart. But remember that David's latter years we don't think much about, his latter years were filled with grief and sorrow over the terrible behavior of his children. And so, if that's where you are, grieving the terrible behavior of your children, I want you to remember tonight that this has been a problem that God's people have always dealt with. This is a Genesis kind of a problem. It's been there all the way from the beginning. And I promise you, there are people all over this country that are making this journey right there with you. I know because I have met them. I've hugged their neck. I've heard their stories. And there are people in this church, in your family, because I've already talked to them. And there are people in this church family who don't have wayward children, but they care about yours. And they care about you. And they wanted to put into practice Galatians 6 and verse 2. They want to help you bear that burden. I will tell you, brothers and sisters, that one of the wonderful surprises for my wife and I has been the way that our brothers and sisters have just rallied around us. They're not judgy. They're not critical. They don't question our parenting. When people found out what was going on with our kid, they just loved on us and supported us and grieved with us. And they will do that for you too. So here's the message tonight. You don't have to keep the secret. And God never intended for you to carry this load by yourself. You're not alone. Now, I hit the button too quick before. Did you get a peek at the next one? So I'm going to talk about this for a while, and you're going to think this is going to be a long night, because I'm going to talk a long time about this second point. So you won't worry about that. The last two are quick. But we need to spend some time on this second one, because it's really the difficult place for parents with prodigals. I want to say to you tonight, it's not your fault. And if it will help, because I know that sounds self-serving, I didn't say that. I'm ripping off my friend. That was the very first thing he wrote to me in his letter. He said, it's not your fault. And then in parentheses he wrote, and whatever you just said in your mind to disagree with what I just said, it's still not your fault. Because he knows. This is the third rail for parents with prodigals. We play the blame game. I cannot tell you how many times I've had this conversation with parents who have wayward children. The question goes like this: where did I go wrong? What did I do when they were growing up that now has worked its way out and caused a spiritual catastrophe? Or what did we fail to do? What should we have been emphasizing more that would have prevented this? But underneath all of that is the belief that if my children at any point in the journey stop serving God, it is because somehow, some way, I failed them as a parent. And there are some who would say, well, of course that's true, because it's what the Bible says, right? You know where I'm going? Proverbs 22, verse 6. Will you look at there in your Bible? Proverbs 22, verse 6. The passage every parent with a prodigal knows well. Let's look at it. Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way that he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So there it is in black and white on the page, right? If you raise your children to serve Jesus, then even when they are grown and old and on their own, they will keep doing it. Now reverse the reasoning. If they don't keep doing it, if they don't keep serving the Lord, it must be because you didn't bring them up right. And so we struggle. What did I do? I think we need to struggle a little more with this verse. I'm not sure the way it has been traditionally treated by some is actually fair with the verse. So I want to tell you two things about Proverbs 22 in verse 6. The first thing I want you to notice with me is this. The verse does not say, bring up your children to serve the Lord. You see that, right? That's how we understand the language. And let me acknowledge, that may be right. He may be saying, raise your children to serve God. I've got a friend who has a little bit of a different nuance on that. He thinks it means to raise your children according to wisdom, picking up on the wisdom theme in Proverbs. But the more I read about this passage and did more research, I discovered that there are actually some people who see something completely different here, and I'll at least throw that out there for you to consider. Some people believe that what the wise man is saying is that you need to raise your children their way. Raise them in a way that is consistent with their abilities and their talents. If I could put that in language we'll all understand. If you've got a son who is more artsy than athletic, don't push him to play football because you want him to play football. Let him be in the band if that's where his talent and his passion lies. Let him sing in the choir if that's what he really wants to do. Raise him up his way. And there's some who read this text and believe that is the point that the wise man is making. By the way, whether it is or not, is it good advice? Yeah, absolutely. We ought to do that. The second thing that I want you to notice is that we're dealing with a proverb. And over again, when we deal with the Proverbs, we recognize that they state things that are generally true, principles that will generally hold true in life. But we also recognize that the proverb doesn't offer us a guarantee in the matters about which they speak. And if that sounds like I'm being a little sketchy with the text, I would just invite you to consider that is exactly the way we understand other proverbs. Back up to chapter 10 for a minute. I'm in Proverbs 10, verse 27. Proverbs 10, verse 27, where the text says, the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. Question, is that true? I think it is. I think it's good wisdom. If you live a godly life, it may very well be that you avoid doing some dumb stuff that might cut your life short. And so it might be anticipated that someone who is godly would have a longer life, right? And someone who does wicked stuff might do some stuff harmful to them, and their life might be shorter, right? I think those ideas are generally true. Let me ask you, is that a guarantee? If I'm good, am I going to live a long life? Guaranteed? Y'all know that's not true. I buried Matt Bassford last November. I know it's not true. Sometimes righteous people live short lives. Sometimes wicked people live long lives. I didn't think Hugh Hefner was ever going to die. Generally true, but not a guarantee. Look at Proverbs 15 and verse 1. This is one of my favorites, actually. Proverbs 15, verse 1. See the same thing. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Is that true? I have found that when someone else is really angry, if I will talk low and slow and answer gently, sometimes I can calm them down, right? But I can tell you from practical experience, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes I talk low and slow and gentle, and they just get madder and madder and madder, right? I think generally that idea is true, but it's not guaranteed, right? Y'all see that, or would y'all like nod, not off, but nod, like, yeah, you see that, that works. I want you to see that because now go back and read again Proverbs 22 and verse 6. What does it say? Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Is that true? I think generally speaking it is. I think if you teach your kids the right things, you instill in them God's wisdom, you point them in the right direction, it is likely that they will continue going that way. You are a testimony to that. Most of you, because mom and dad trained you and pointed you in the right direction. And look where you are tonight, sitting in a church building on Thursday night. How about that? But it doesn't always happen that way. Proverbs 22:6 is not a guarantee, is it? And we know that. We know that there are no guarantees with children because we are not the deciders with children. Ultimately, they grow up and they decide. We just get to be a player in the early part of the drama that is their life. I think we want Proverbs 22 to be a guarantee, don't we? I think we want it to be a guarantee because we want to believe if I could just check all the boxes right, it will turn out right. Let me tell you something about that. Two problems. Number one, nobody checks all the boxes right all the time. Nobody. And even if you could, you raised a free moral agent who may make a different choice. There are no guarantees. So we might need to think more carefully about how we treat this verse. But I doubt getting a better understanding of Proverbs 22:6 is going to do a lot to alleviate guilt, because I still think most parents with wayward kids are just convinced that somewhere back there I messed up. And that's why all of this has gone wrong with them. We want to draw this clean, straight line from their collapse to parental failure. And what I want to do as we finish up thinking about this point is I want to mess up your clean line, okay? Because it isn't a clean line. This isn't simple. It's complicated and it's messy. Even before I had a wayward kid, I was losing too many young people. And I started digging into this and researching this. And what I discovered is you talk to people who've lost their faith, and it's never about one thing. It's about lots and lots of things that contributed to the destabilizing of their faith. So let me just talk to you a little bit about that. Number one, let me say to you that I do think parents play a role in that. I think parents have a part. Look ahead to Proverbs chapter 29. Proverbs 29, and look down to verse number 15. Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way, now there's some parent stuff going on there, brings shame to his mother. And so clearly, in this proverb, parental failures contribute to kid trouble later in life and grief for parents. And so verse 17 says, correct your son, and he will give you comfort. He will also delight your soul. And so, hear me say tonight, what parents are doing is important. Listen, I've loved all the little kids running around this church. But what that means is there are a lot of mom and dads who right now you're playing the part in their life that you're going to get to play. This is your season. And what you do matters. It impacts the future of the journey. You hear me saying that? It's important. But now let me mess this up a little bit more. You do realize that nobody's going to parent perfectly, right? It's kind of a strange thing about the arrangement God set up. He gives little children to people who have no experience raising little children. I know this. I'm a grandfather. Nobody sees it better than Grandpa does, right? In a sense, parents and children grow up together. And just like your kids blow it and mess up sometimes, so do you. In fact, you really want this to get interesting? Those people can line up all of their faithful children. Guess what? They had blunders as parents too. Worse than that, they had some of the same blunders that you did. Everyone messes up at being a parent. The problem is with prodigals, we start looking back and saying, well, which blunder was the one that caused the catastrophe? But the truth is, some of these parents who have all these faithful children had the same blunders you did. In fact, let me add it further so it messes this up. Have you ever noticed how parenting and outcome don't always line up? I know it sounds self-serving as a parent with a prodigal, but everything I'm saying tonight sounds self-serving, okay? Just roll with me. You know it's true. You've seen some parents who seem to be doing all the right things from what you were able to judge from the outside, and it turned out just like you would expect with all of their kids, except for the one who, like the younger brother, prodigal son, he was just a rebel. He went against everything mom and dad said, right? What's really weird is it's reverse of that. Have you ever seen parents who were terrible parents and had great kids? I mean, that's even in the Bible. Go back and read Josiah's story. What a wacky family he came from. And look what a great king he was. How does that work? And then let me add that I'm not the only person that's going to influence my kid. Still in Proverbs chapter 1 this time. Proverbs chapter 1. Will you look there? Proverbs 1, verse 8. The wise man said, hear, my son, your father's instructions. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. Pause. Here's a kid whose parents did all the right things. Wise man says you've got great teaching from your mom and dad that can be ornaments and a wreath for you to adorn yourself with that will bless you. Parents who gave their kid the right thing. But the very next verse says, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. How can that be a danger if mom and dad did all the right thing? Because after mom and dad have had their say, then other people get their say. And other people are going to speak to our kids. And they will have the option of hearing that voice. Maybe it's going to be a crowd of friends that they run around with at school. Maybe it'll be a very influential professor at college. Maybe it's going to be some boy or girl that they fall in love with and begins to influence them about spiritual things. And maybe it'll have nothing to do with people at all. Maybe it'll be just life stuff. I had a young lady tell me one time that her faith was terribly upset because she was really close to a high school teacher and had a troubled home. And so this teacher had really been a support to her. And the teacher suddenly got cancer and died. And she said, honestly, I was just mad at God because he knew how much I needed this person. It was destabilizing to their faith. The death of a loved one, an unfaithful spouse, and an ugly divorce. All these things can serve to upset the faith of a disciple. The point I'm driving to, brothers and sisters, is that people don't lose their faith because of one bad episode that happened in their childhood. Quit trying to draw the straight line. It's not that straight. Lots of things can happen to us along the way that undermine our faith. We all have to decide how we will respond to them. Which, by the way, is what I think my friend meant when he wrote to me and said, it's not your fault. I don't think that was a commentary on my parenting. I don't think he was saying, no, David, you were really a great parent. I think what he was saying is, whatever you gave your son, good or bad, at the end of the day, it's not your fault because it's not your choice. Everyone makes their own decision about God. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, Paul says that we all must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each one may give an answer for the deeds done in the body, according to what we've done, whether good or bad. I will go before God. I will answer to God for my life. And I won't be able to go before God and say, I would have served you better, but I had a lot of friends that were bad influence on me growing up. It's really their fault. Or I would have served you, but I had this really influential college professor who filled my mind with evolution. And that really destabilized my faith. You need to hold the professor accountable for what happened to me. I married someone who just wouldn't encourage me in my walk with the Lord. She was a spiritual drag on me. By that way, that's hypothetical. My wife's awesome, okay? Don't misunderstand that. Or if my mom and dad had just had more family Bible studies with me, if they had prayed beside my bed more often in the evenings, if mom and dad had done more, then I would have served the Lord. I don't get to say that. Whatever my parents did for me, good or bad, at the end of the day, I stand before God and I answer for the choice I made. That's why Josiah served the Lord. 2 Chronicles 34 and verse 3. Even though he had very wicked heritage before him, very wicked family life, Josiah served the Lord because Josiah chose to serve the Lord. And at the end of the day, whatever you did for your kids, good or bad, they will decide. And if they decide not to serve God, it's their fault, not yours. Now, I know I haven't covered everything in that because inevitably somebody will say, but you don't understand, David. I know that I failed my kids. I've talked to people who weren't even Christians when they were raising their kids. They didn't know anything about Christ. They didn't know anything about the gospel. They learned the gospel later in life. And now they look back, their kids are grown. They don't have an opportunity to bring them up anymore in the way that the Lord would want them to go. And so if you're in that predicament, maybe you were just a nominal Christian when your kids were growing up, or maybe you weren't a Christian at all and you're looking back with deep regret. Can I make the suggestion to you? Write your kids a letter and apologize. I wish I'd been more faithful to the Lord when you were growing up. And I would love to tell you about him now if you'd be willing to sit down and let me do that. And then remember, at that point, they decide. Everyone makes their decision about God and answers for that decision before God. It's not your fault. Now, if I was being fair with you guys, I would have to say that I understand that up here. My brain processes that in the right way. I'm working on it down here. Because down here, I still feel like a big fat failure. Right? Sometimes that takes a little longer. It's not your fault. I told you that was going to be the long one, right? I'm looking at the clock back there. 2 more and we're done. The third thing I want to say to you is never give up. I'm putting that on the list because my friend put that in his letter. And I have to confess, when I read it, I was mad at him. I didn't tell him I was mad at him, but I was. In my brain, I said, what do you mean never give up? This is my kid. I love my kid. Of course, I would never give up. I'll fight for his deliverance and return for the rest of my life. I was so naive. I mean, this was like the first year. And it's been a decade. I had no idea what was coming. How dark the days would get and how difficult the journey would be. And I am embarrassed to admit before you tonight that I've said the words. I've looked at my wife and I have said, I am done with him. We're not getting anywhere. His heart is hardened. He is not ever coming back. What's the point? I would just be so frustrated that I'd throw up my hands and I would say, I'm finished. I give up. And then I would think about that letter. And I would be reminded, don't ever give up. And so I'm saying that to you too. Because there may be some dark days coming for you and your family, and it may be a really difficult season. And so I'm going to say it to you so you'll remember I said it when you need it. Don't give up. You know what's helpful to me? I have found this verse in Ephesians 3. And sometimes I just need to lean here for a little while. Ephesians 3 and verse 20. Paul has this great climactic crescendo as he wraps up the first part of this letter. And he said, now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we can ask or think, according to the power that works within us, to him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations, forever and ever. Amen. And so what I lean on is to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we can ask or think. When I've run out of options, I know that God hasn't. When I don't know the way, I know that he does. And sometimes I just have to be patient and lean on him and wait. And you will have to do that too. Now, can I unpack this just a little more? Because I'm worried when I say never get up that I have just loaded your weapon and you're going to go home and you're going to blow up your children. And I don't want you to do that. So can we unpack this just a little bit? Because when I say never give up, I am not saying what you need to do is just press this with them constantly and drive them crazy by haranguing them over this every single day, right? I am not saying that. In fact, I want to point you to Colossians chapter 4. We talked a little bit there earlier in the week. I want to go back there and remind you that Colossians 4, beginning of that chapter, he's dealing with our relationships with outsiders. And one of the big mental transition points for me is when I said to myself, my son is a lost person. I know that sounds weird, that I had to kind of grow to understand that. I didn't start there. I thought my kid was just a confused kid. And over time, what I had to recognize is, no, this is a lost soul who needs to be rescued. And I thought about all the work I'd done with lost people over the years and how I needed to collect that data and use it to try to reach my son, just like I would try to reach any lost person. And so Colossians 4 has great data in it. Can I point you to some of this? Colossians 4, look at verse 2. He says, devote yourself to prayer, keeping alert in it with an attitude of thanksgiving, praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up to us a door for the word so that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ for which I've been imprisoned, that I may make it clear in the way that I ought to speak. Watch 4 and 5. These are great. Conduct yourself with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so you will know how you should respond to each person. And so, like this could be a whole class, just walking through this. All I'm trying to say to you right now is, verse 5 says, be wise. And specifically, he says, be wise in the way that you talk to lost people. Think about your words so that they give you the greatest advantage. They're most helpful in the moment. And if I could just put something under that wisdom umbrella, sometimes what that means is knowing when you need to not say anything. So 2 years ago, my son told me he didn't want to study anymore. And I had to stop talking. And that is really hard to do. But I had to stop talking. And I thought that I would probably die. I'm still here. What it has done, however, is give me the opportunity to just take little bitty shots periodically. Find little moments just to drop in something for him to think about. You know what? I've accomplished more with my kid in the last 2 years than I did in the previous 8, when we were having Bible studies all the time. You don't want to have a Bible study. Now that we're not doing that, I can drop in little thoughts periodically that he will take and simmer over, and sometimes we'll even talk about those a little bit more. There's a time to be quiet. If you keep forcing the issue, you may harden the heart so they won't talk to you at all anymore. Now, don't think I'm saying when you don't talk, we don't do anything. Because again, go back to Colossians 4, begin up at verse 2. There are other things to do there. Like, for example, he said, be devoted to prayer in the context of working with outsiders. We need to think way more about praying when we think about our work with people who need to find their way to Jesus. And so, even when I'm not talking to my son, I'm praying for him, praying all the time. And one of the things that Paul says he wants the Colossians to pray for are open doors, that God may open to us a door for the word. I think this is where we get things backwards. Sometimes because they're our kids, and we haven't figured out they're grown adults yet, they're our kids. We think we could force the issue and say, you're going to study with me because I'm dad. That doesn't carry the same weight when they're off the payroll, okay? Just remember that. I think what we need to do, instead of getting ahead of God and forcing the door, we need to get behind God and let him open it. So even when you're not talking, what you can be doing is praying for God to work providentially in their lives to open a door. If you want it, I have a whole list of things I pray. I have a list of prodigal prayers. It's a whole class. I'm not going to preach that sermon tonight, but I'm happy to share it with you if you're interested in things that you can pray for. And remember, as long as they're here and we're here and the Lord hasn't come, there's still time. And so don't ever give up. I'd like to stop there because I don't like the last point. But I need to say this to you. The last thing I want to say to you is you're going to have to continue. You're going to have to continue the journey. You're going to have to continue the journey without your kid. That is so hard for me to say because it wasn't the plan. Did you guys talk about your plans for your kids before they were born? When Heidi was big and pregnant, we would just reminisce about what life was going to be like when we have our children. But I can tell you, of all the dreams we had and the things we wanted to do, there was one kind of overarching thing that rose above everything else. We just wanted our kids to serve the Lord because we wanted to spend eternity with them. And we would happily give up every other success and victory and joy that our children had brought us just to know that we would be an eternity together. And I hate to say this because I know there are parents in the crowd with little kids, and this is going to be kind of hard to hear. But there's going to come a point in life where they're going to make their own choice about that, because everyone makes their own choice about God. And they may not make the choice you want them to make. I will tell you this, that if it isn't with your children, you're going to have to deal with this from someone, right? If it's not your kids, maybe it's your mom. And if it's not your mom, maybe it's some cousin or some aunt that is special to you. And if it's not anyone in your immediate family, I promise that somewhere along the way, that as you make this journey, there is going to be someone that you thought, we are going to do this all the way together. Someone that's going to drop out and turn back and quit. Some couple you were close to, and the husband cheats on his wife and leaves her and leaves the Lord, and you're just going to be shell-shocked. And you're wondering, what happened here? And so when it happens, what we do is this great rescue mission happens, right? Someone kind of drifts off of what we do. We go back and get them, which, by the way, it's exactly what's supposed to happen. Someone drifts away, we don't let them get very far before we're out there trying to attach a lifeline and pull them back in. And sometimes it works. I love the comeback stories. When I first started talking about this, people would come out in the lobby and they'd say, hey, don't ever give up on your son. I was gone 15 years and look where I am. I'm back today. And I didn't say this to them, but I would think, 15 years? I don't want to go 15 minutes. I want this fixed today and now. Decade. Here's my question. What if you try and they won't hear you? And you try again, and they won't hear you. And others try, and they won't hear them. They won't hear anybody. And they never. What are you going to do? I want you to hear me on this, okay? Please, hear this. This is what you're going to do when someone you care about turns back. You're going to get up and you're going to dust yourself off. And you're going to keep going. Hear me on that. No matter what. Because the devil would delight to make me and you the collateral damage of someone else's spiritual catastrophe. Don't let him do that to you. I have some brothers and sisters that I just love dearly that stopped walking with Jesus. But I'm not going to stop. And I want you to hear me tonight. If my son never comes back to the Lord, I am not leaving the Lord. Even if my wife, who I love more than anyone else on the planet, if she were to decide to turn away and leave Jesus, I am not going with her. I don't care if I am the only one in my family who is with him in the end. I am going to be with Jesus in the end. Because there isn't anything more important than that. So hear me on this. Whoever it is that's broken your heart because they've walked away from Jesus, don't you go with them. That is exactly what the devil is trying to do. You get up, you keep going, you continue the journey, you stick with it all the way to the end. What do you think about Luke 15 as we close? That's the passage we read at the beginning. And at the end, I want you to think about Luke 15, but I just want you to think about the Father in the story of Luke 15. What a terrible ordeal he went through. He had this rebellious son, a beloved son who was a rebellious son, who turns away from him, demands his inheritance, which you weren't supposed to get until your dad died. And so it's in essence as though this boy is saying, I wish you were dead so I can have my stuff. And he gives it to him, and this kid goes off. And he squanders it doing terrible things, living a horribly wicked life. Ends up destitute on the verge of starving to death. And there it was. There's the moment that he was broken. And he said, well, my dad feeds his servants. And I'll go back home. And I'll just be a servant. Least I can eat. Now think about the dad. And the son coming home. He doesn't have to think about it. He doesn't hold his failures over his head. He doesn't say, come back to me when you get some things worked out in your life. Don't you know the kid reeked after being with the pigs and walking home? And what does his dad do? He embraces and kisses that dirty, smelly, rebellious, broken kid. You know why I want you to think about the Father. Folks, the Father is God. The Father is our Father. And we are the rebellious child. And so I just wonder tonight, if someone's sitting in the crowd, say, listen, maybe other people, but I know God doesn't want me. David, you just don't know what I've done. You don't know how I've lived. My life has been ugly and dirty. I carry the stench of all the awful things that I've done in my life. I just know God doesn't want me. And I'm telling you, you are just wrong about that. Not only does He want you, right now He watches this moment, hoping and longing that tonight will be your night and you'll come home. He just wants you to come home. He doesn't want you to go get your life all straightened out first. That's backwards. What He says is, you come to me. You just come to me broken and fix this together. You just need to come home. So here's the question hanging in the air tonight. How many times have you broken His heart? How many times has He watched you stand and singing that song? Maybe you even gripped the pew to keep you in that place so you wouldn't come home tonight. Question is, are you going to break His heart? Or will you launch the celebration in heaven? I don't want you thinking about anything else during this song except the Father who watches. Please come home while we stand, while we sing.